understanding of what pivot tables are. So yes, we will be covering pivot tables in today's class. Now, this entire pivot table will take about an hour or so, because I'll not only talk about pivot table, I'll talk about different parts of the pivot table, like pivot fields, pivot table style options, pivot charts, and other stuff. I'll talk about slices, timelines, a lot of stuff. So by the end of this session, you should know, let's say 60 to 70% of the pivot table. And if you practice, then I'm sure you can master pivot tables very easily. So let's go ahead. This is the roadmap. I'll be talking about pivot cache, pivot tables, pivot charts, and then we'll have questions. But before we go ahead, let me ask you a very simple question. What are pivot tables? Do you think this is like just a normal table? So I've already covered about tables in my previous class. What do you think are pivot tables? So pivot tables are one of the most useful and powerful features in Microsoft Excel. Okay, and a pivot table is also one of the basic data analysis tools. So if you're serious about your career in data analytics, then you need to know pivot tables like the back of your hand. Before we create our first pivot table, let's first understand what exactly a pivot table is. So in short, a pivot table is a summary of your data. They can help businesses group the data in a specific manner to quickly arrive at important conclusions. So pivot tables are very useful, specifically when you have a very huge data set. If it's a small data set, I doubt you'll need a pivot table. A lot of rows, a lot of columns, a lot of data is there. Then yes, you will require a pivot table. Pivot table may look very scary in the beginning, but by the end of this video, you will realize they are very user-friendly. They're super easy to understand. Okay, so let's start working with them. Right, so as you can see the screenshot here, what the thing is, this, let's say, is your data. Okay, when you manually insert a pivot table in a worksheet, you will notice that the pivot is instantly created. But the entire process behind the scene is not that simple. So what happens is when you create a pivot table, the right side of the image happens. From the table, you directly see the pivot table. But in actual scenario, what exactly is happening is a pivot cache is created. So what Excel does is it creates something which is called a pivot cache. A pivot cache holds a replica of your data on which the pivot is based. And that is the reason why when you make a change to the data source, it is not instantly reflected in the pivot table. You must right click on the pivot table and click on refresh. What happens when you click on refresh? The pivot cache is first refreshed and then it reflects in the pivot table. Okay, I will cover about refreshing the pivot table shortly. So don't get worried. Oh, what's all this? It's just something which I'm sharing it with you. Pivot table, the pivot cache rather, is very important when you're creating pivot tables using VBA programming. Then you'll understand what pivot cache is. But right now, I'm just giving you an overview. Excel creates a pivot cache, and using that pivot cache, a pivot table is created. Okay, so without wasting any more time, let's move on to Excel. Okay, so everybody has downloaded the Excel file? I hope you have downloaded. For the people who are new, please do see the first video where I have shown how to import the data into Excel. So I'm going to quickly import the data from the file. It's the same file that we used in the previous two videos. It's the CSV file, the video game sales. So just import this. Everybody has imported. Just keep up with me so that we all will work together. Okay, let's continue. So when you manually insert a pivot table in a worksheet, you will notice that pivot is, one moment. Yeah. Okay, so we have imported the data. Now what happens is, if you notice here, there's a year column and the date is the year is actually left aligned. Okay, so what is happening here is the number is stored as text. So we have to be very careful when we have to create a pivot table. Okay, since we have already imported the data, there are a lot of things I will take you through first before we go ahead. One important thing before we create the pivot table is ensure that you have column headers in every column. You have rank, you have name, platform, year, ensure that every column has a header. None of the cell in the column header should be blank, because if any one of them is blank, you will get an error. Okay. Also ensure that there are no empty columns or rows anywhere. Forget about the header. Even the columns or the rows should not be empty, because if it is empty, then the extra data will not get included in the pivot table. Okay. Also ensure that there are no subtotal or total rows. So usually the table, if you notice in the previous video, we included some total rows. Ensure they are not there, because if they are there, then your pivot table will not show you accurate data. So ensure that you delete those rows before continuing. If you do not take care of that, of all these rather, then you will get an error. The next thing that I want to share with you is this particular year column, which I wanted to talk about. Now, when you import data, sometimes the data is stored as text, the number is stored as text. So you have to convert this to number so that we can work with it. Okay, so it's very simple. I'm going to show you okay, before I show you the tip, let me share a function with you. How do I know this is text and this is not a number? So there's a function which is called isNumber. So if I type isNumber, start parenthesis, and I select this cell, see, it says true. So what is happening is this function, the isNumber function, it is used to find if the cell value is numerical value or not. Now, if I do the same thing with this particular cell, and if I press enter, it gives me false. That means Excel is not able to recognize this as a number. It is recognizing this as a text. So I'm going to share another tip with you, and I will talk about this in one of my future videos. So how would you convert the entire column of numbers stored as text into numbers? Select the entire column, go to the data tab, and click on text to columns and click on finish. Okay, once again, select the column, go to the data tab, click on text to columns and click on finish. And the numbers now are converted to numbers from text. If you look at this cell now, see, it's showing true. That means this is now a number. So remember this tip. Okay, it's a very amazing tip. You will require this tip a lot when you are working as data analysts. Okay, what else? Okay, next everything is fine. Now let's go and create our first pivot table. Okay, so go to the insert tab. In the insert tab, there is the tables group, and you'll see two buttons here, pivot table and recommended pivot table styles. If you choose the first option, which is the recommended pivot styles, let's click on this, see what happens. So Excel gives you recommended pivot tables dialog box. Here you can choose if there is any specific style that you like. We will not go into this at the moment. I will explain this later at the end of the video when I talk about how to use this option. We will use the first option, which is pivot table. When you click on this, you get this dialog box which says select a table or range. Okay, you can use this and then select whatever it is. But we have already seen that the Excel has selected the table. Let's continue. So if this was not a table, right now, if you noticed, my table name is video game sales. I've talked about tables in my previous video. If this was not a table, then what would happen is, let me show you something. Suppose I have some data here in a new sheet. I'll call it header 1 and header 2. Okay, I've got some data and 1 and 2. Okay, let's put 1 and 2. And if I go to, let's say, insert and pivot table, see how it is now giving you not the table name, but the sheet name and the range address. So what happens here is why this, now you'll understand why tables are important. If now I add any data on the 4th row or the 3rd column, the pivot table will not include that data. This is the reason why we always convert our data to a table first before we create the pivot table. Because when you try to do that, Excel will include the pivot table field name rather than the sheet name and the cell address. This way, when you add more data to the table, whether it is at the row or at the column, the pivot table, or rather the pivot cache, will automatically include that. And when you refresh the table, you can see all that data. Yeah, so I already showed it to you in the last video how the table includes the data the moment you add that. Here you have two options. You can choose where you want the pivot table to be placed. The first option is new worksheet. The second option is existing worksheet. So if you choose existing worksheet, then you can choose one of the worksheets which are there in the workbook. You can even create the pivot table in the same sheet. But we'll not do that. I will create it in a new worksheet. Okay. The next option is add this data to the data model. I'll not talk about data model yet because there's a lot of stuff which is included in the data model. I will definitely cover about this in the future video. Okay, so I'm going to click on OK. And you will notice that the pivot table, a blank pivot table, is created in a new worksheet. So here you have something which is called a pivot table fields list, and this is your blank pivot table. Okay, so this pivot table list, what it does is it shows you the name of all the columns. So these are called fields. So you have rank, you have name, you have platform. So if you go back to your data, you will notice that it is nothing but these headers. So let's go back here. Okay, now this is the settings tool. And if by any chance, let's say, if you close this pivot fields box by clicking on this cross button, do not worry. Click on the pivot table and you notice that the pivot table analyze tab and the design tab becomes active. Just like in the tables in the previous video, we had specific tabs. The same thing is with pivot table. Okay, so the moment you click outside, those two tabs will disappear. Right, so if you click on this, these two tabs come back. Let's say you close the pivot table fields pane by mistake. Don't worry, click on the pivot analyze and click on the field list and you will get it back. Okay, so this is the pivot table fields list. Here we have something which is the tools button. If you click on this, this will define the layout of your pivot table. I will come back to this. So if you look at this field list, right now the field is on the top and the areas are at the bottom. You can change that if you do not like it. So if you put, let's say, field section and area section side by side, it becomes like this next to each other. So I like the first option, so I'll go back to that. Feel free to experiment with it. Whichever option you like, just select that. Okay, and these are the different areas. Here, what you can do is you can drop the fields and then the pivot table automatically gets updated. Okay, right above the field list is the search box. You see the search box? This was added from Excel 2016 onwards. So if you have a version which is older than 2016, then you will not see this. The search box can help you quickly find a field name if you have a lot of fields here. Right now we have very few fields, so it is very easy to navigate. But in case you have a lot of fields, you can start typing. Let's say if I type publisher, See how it filters the name of the fields. So anything which starts with PUB, all the names will come here. So feel free to use the search box. Okay, and in some of the 4 areas that you see here, do you see filters, columns, values, and rows? In some of the Excel versions, they have different names. Okay, and in some Excel versions, this will be called as report filter, if I'm not wrong, and this will be shown as column labels, and rows may be shown as rows labels. They all behave the same, so don't worry about this namings if it is slightly different. Okay, you can just drag a particular field into a particular section and it will work. For example, let's take an example. I want to see the sales of a particular publisher. So this is the publisher field. Now what I will do is I will move the publisher to the rows section. See what happens. Once you add a field to a particular section, that field will appear in the matching area of the pivot table. Okay, so right now I have all the publishers here because I have put it in the rows. If you do not drag, but simply check, you can, okay, now let me remove this. Okay, I've removed everything. If you do not want to drag, or if you do not drag, but simply click on the checkbox like this, then depending on what kind of value it has, Excel will put the field in the relevant area. For example, if the field has text values, then it will put the field in the rows area. This is the rows area. And if the field has numeric values, then it will put the field in the values area. So if I click on NA sales, North America sales, so it comes into the values section. So you can try it, check it, uncheck it. I do not prefer checking. I rather prefer dragging it. It's much more easier. Okay. The other way is to right click on a particular field and then click on whether you want to add it to the report filter, row labels, column labels, or values. So I've shown you now 3 ways to add these fields to these 4 areas. Okay. Now I have put NA sales here. It's in the value area. To remove a field, simply uncheck. So if you uncheck this, it will go off. If you check this, it will come back. You can also drag and bring it back and it will remove it. Okay, so now we can see the sales for these publishers. Since I've dragged it in the values field, you'll see that the sales are here. You can add more fields if you want to show additional details about the data. So to keep this video very simple, I'm going to now add a genre. Okay, so let's say I add this under a specific publisher. The moment I do this, see how the data is now bifurcated. So here you have publisher and here you have genre. Yeah, very simple. Nothing complex about it. It's all about dragging, nothing, no typing, no entering of formulas. You can directly drag it. And it is added to the rows area of the pivot table layout. And then you can see the total sum of sales for each genre under a specific publisher. Okay, let's go ahead. If you want to further access the data for a specific year, then you can do that as well. So let's move the year to the filters area. So I'm going to drag this on the filters area. You'll notice that now you have the year on the top. If you want to see the data for a specific year, then you can simply select the year from here. Right now it shows all. So if I don't want to see all the data, I want to see only the data for 1981, I can do that. And I can click OK. It'll show me the data only for 1981. I can also go ahead and do multiple items. So I want 1980 and 1981. I can do that as well. If you want everything back, then click on all. It will be all of it. The other way we can handle this is by including slices for pivot table. If you remember in the last video, I spoke about slices and we used slices for tables. You can also insert slices for your pivot table as well. Okay, how do I do that? So click inside the pivot table so that this pivot table analyze bar the tab is visible, and then click on insert slicer and then click on year. So now we have a year slicer. This will do the same thing. So if you click on 1981, the data automatically gets filtered. Okay, let me remove the year from the filter. We don't need this. And now if you click on 1980, it'll show you for 1980. If you click on 1981, it'll show you for 1981. And if you want to do multiple selections, then you can use this button, which is multi-select. This way you can do multiple selections. And to clear the filter, click on the clear filter button and we are done. So slices are usually used by the data analyst when they are showing all this in our dashboard. So this is a very important feature. I would recommend understanding this. There is something which is called insert timeline. I'll come to insert timelines at the end of this video. I'll talk about this. Okay, let's go ahead. So now we have a basic pivot table ready. Okay, we can do other stuff with it. Let's understand what all we can do with this. Let's say besides seeing the sum of the sales, I also want to see the average of the NS sales. So how do I go about it? What I will do is I'm going to drag the same field again since I cannot check on it, and I'll drag it and I will put it here. So now I have 2 columns. Basically, they are doing the same thing. So how do I change this so that it shows me the average? I'll move the slicer slightly towards the right so that if the column increases, decreases, this does not affect our view. Okay. So what you can do is select on the pivot table, your pivot table field list comes, and select the second field list, and you will notice that this pop-up comes. At the bottom, you have value field settings. Click on that. And you get this window where here you can see the custom name. Now, I don't want this to show. I want a specific name. You can do that. Okay. So if you're not able to see that, I'll do it again. Click on this, click on value field settings. And I will call it, let's say, average sales. I've given it a name. In the summarize value field by, which is this below section, you can choose the calculation type. We will keep it as average because that's what we want to show. The moment you select this, you'll notice the custom name changes again. Don't worry, go ahead, change it back, average sale. Okay, once you do that, click on OK. And you will notice that the header is now average sale and the values are no longer the same as this. Though both of these columns are referring to the same NA sales field, but they're showing different values. Now, I don't like the way this data is shown. So many decimal places. So don't worry, you can also take care of this. How do we do that? So you go back to the value field setting. Let me show you another way to do that. Right click on the column and you have value field settings. Click on that and you will get this box again, dialog box. Click on the number format. Go to number and in the decimal places, fix the number of decimal places to 2 and click on OK. And finally, click on OK and the data will be formatted to 2 decimal places. I'm going to press Ctrl Z. I'm going to show you another way to do that. Right click on the column and click on number format. You can also access that option from the number format. Do not click on format cells because format cells, what will happen is when you refresh the table, the row may be or the cell may be included in the pivot table or it may not be. So do not use format cells, use number format. If you click on this, you will get the same thing. Click on number, 2 decimal places and click on OK. Now here the values are in millions, so there are only 2 or 3 values, characters rather. If there were values like 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, you can use something which is also called a 1000 separator. So if you use 1000 separator, then let's say 10,000 will become 10, 1000. It will display as that. So you can use that here. So I've clicked on OK, and now my data is formatted. I hope it's very clear till now. Similarly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to total sales. So I click on value field settings and I change this to total sales. I do not need to change the number format. It's only 2 decimal places. But in case you want to be sure, go to number, 2 decimal places. OK. And you're done. The benefit of doing this is if there are some single values like 0, they also get formatted and they'll show you 2 decimal places. It's very important that your data should look consistent. OK. OK, let's go ahead. I'm going to just bring that window again. Value field settings. Here you notice that we had summarized values by. We already covered this. There's something which is called show value as. Okay. Now, what does show value as do? So what happens is right now, the show value as are not doing any kind of calculation. It's just showing you a simple sum. What if I want to know what is the contribution of every publisher towards the total sales? Okay, I want to know what is the total sales. So click on this and you'll see something, a drop-down list which gives you a lot of options. So the first one is percentage of total sales. I'm going to click on this. Let's see what it does. Okay, let's do that. Once this is done, I'll click on 1981 to narrow it down. Okay, 1981 doesn't have the data. Let's go to 1982. Yeah, now we can see some data. So here, what is happening is if you scroll down, you'll see that there's a grand total at the bottom. Here, what we can see is 20th Century Fox video games, they contributed to 2.04% of the total sales. Similarly, Activision, it gave 6.50. So when you're showing this kind of information, you can use this option. So on your dashboards, if you want to show the top 10 contributors towards the sale, you can use this option. Okay, there are other options as well. Right click on it. And if you click on this, you'll see percentage of column total. So column total, I will come to this in a moment because as you can see, there are no columns totals, which is the grand total. I'll come to this in a moment. So I would request you to go ahead, experiment with these values, see what values do you get. Again, right now it is formatted as percentage with 2 decimal places. If you want to decrease it to 1 decimal places, click on number format and you can change that. As simple as that. Right. So let's go back and click on pivot table, analyze. Okay. Before that, let's come to design tab. Let's explore more options. Now, do you see a few things which are in bold in the rows? These are called subtotals. Yeah. So if you go to the design tab, you will see subtotals option. If you do not want to see subtotals, you can switch it off and the subtotals are gone. If you want to show subtotals, click on show all subtotals and it will come back. You again have a choice. You can either show at the top of the group like it was by default, or you can show at the bottom of the group. So the subtotals will move down. I usually do not change this. I keep it at the top of the group. So I leave it as that. Next to subtotals is something which is called grand total. If you click on this, you again get options. Off for rows, on for rows and columns, on for rows, whatever it is. So if you switch it on, then what happens is when you have a extra field, then the grand totals come here. Okay, it's very simple when you experiment with this. So if you want, let's remove the average field from here. Okay, we have removed that, and let's add a platform field, which is this, to the columns area. Okay, so now you have columns here. Again, this is showing all. In case you want to show one particular value, you can do that, or you can select multiple values. Now, do you notice how the grand totals have come here? So this is the grand total here and the grand total here. So if you go back to design, and if you, let's say, off for rows and columns, see the grand totals have disappeared, not only from the row, but also from the columns. If you do not want one of them, then you can switch it as well. So right now you have here, and it is not there. So the column grand totals are not there, but the row grand total is there. So remember, you can tweak these options and you will be able to create the grand totals for specific items. Let's go ahead. Now this is the report layout. There are different kind of layouts that you can show. If you say, I want to see the compact form of pivot table, click on this. Obviously this is compact, so let's go ahead. Show outline form. You can see outline form. You can see tabular form. There are different ways that you can show your pivot table. So you can do compact as well. Choose your layout, whatever you want. You should know where these options are so that you can do that. Okay, now there are blank, you can insert blank line after each item. If you click on that, see how the blank lines, they come. If you would want to remove it, you can do that as well. If I clear the filter, everything will come. See? So depending on what you want to show, you can do that. So I'm going to just, for demonstration purpose, I'm going to show only 3 of them this way. Right. This pivot table style options, if you remember, this is something similar to our tables. If you remember the table tab, which we saw in the previous video, you can switch on or off the row headers. Yeah. You can switch on off the column headers. You can use banded rows. You can use banded columns. So this is pretty straightforward. If you like a particular format, you can go ahead and give them a particular shade of color. So these are divided into 3 shades, light, medium, and dark. Choose whatever style you want. And just like I showed in the previous video, how you can create a new style, you can do it for pivot table as well. And if you do not like a particular style, click on clear, it will remove the design. Now, let's go ahead and let's come here. Okay. If you want to know what is the name of your pivot table, you can get it here. You can also give it a unique name. Yeah, just like you gave the names for these columns, you can also give a unique name. One thing I want to share with you, when you are giving the names of the columns here, ensure that you do not give a name which is similar to one of these column headers, because if you do that, then Excel will give an error. For example, right now, platform is the field name. So if I give platform here, see what happens. Excel gives an error. It says pivot field name already exists. That means I can't use this name. Yeah, so always give meaningful names which are not duplicated. Right. Below the pivot table name, we have pivot table options. You have a lot of options here to work with. So here you can merge and center data, the cells with labels. You can show whether there are any values. In the last video, somebody asked me if there are empty cells or empty rows, how do I show it here? So it is up to you. You can either show it as blank. And if let's say there are errors, you can show them as errors, or you can put a dash here. When you put a dash, if there are any errors, it will show as dash. By default, the pivot table columns are auto fit. Yeah. So if you uncheck this, you'll have to manually auto fit it. Now, when you are creating a dashboard, you may want to uncheck this option, which is auto fit columns, because what happens is if you have a slicer next to the table, and if you do not uncheck this, then the columns will increase and they'll come behind the slicer. Unfortunately, the slicer does not automatically adjust with the pivot table. So always remember that if you're creating dashboards, uncheck this option so that the position of the slices does not get hampered. So once again, there are different kind of options here. Most of it we have already covered through right click and all that. There are display and printing options, not very important at the time being. What is important is how you create the table, how you arrange the fields, how you make them show sum or average or count, whatever you want to show. Those are very important things that you need to know at the beginning. At a later stage, when you want to, let's say, print it, then you can go into print options and rest of the stuff. Coming down to the next session, which is active field. Wherever the cursor is, depending on that, you can see what is the active field. Right now, the active field is genre, which is action. If you click on here, it will show the active field is publisher. And based on where you have your cursor, clicking on the field settings will show you that options. So again, I've already covered about subtotals. You can choose to show subtotals or you can choose not to show subtotals. Basically, a lot of stuff which you can access from a lot of places. Do you see this plus icon, this minus icon here? So this is to expand the field and collapse the field. Right now, everything is expanded. So if you click on collapse, see how everything collapses. If you click on this, it will expand. You can also do that by clicking on this plus minus. Yeah, you can easily do that. Okay, if you do not want these plus minus icons to show in your pivot table, there's this button which is called plus minus buttons. If you click on that, you will notice the plus minus is gone. I always keep them. I do not remove them because when I give pivot table to my clients, they want to experiment with it. They want to play with it. So leave them here. Okay, now coming to ungrouping and grouping. Okay, this is something which I will also cover in the video. So what happens is if you want to group data, yeah, so you can go to data group, yeah, and it will create a group. I'll not go too much into group right now, but yes, this can also be done in a pivot table. Okay, I've already explained about insert slicer. Let's come down to insert timeline. Now, what exactly is a timeline? Does anybody know what's a timeline? Timelines are interactive filters that let you quickly filter by date. Just like we did with slices, you can also do it with timelines. To understand how this works, I can't use timeline here because there is no date field. I have a year field, but It's not a date. I have some raw data here. It's a very small piece of data which I copied from here. All that I did here was I added a date of sale column. Just one column I added. Okay. Now, if I create the pivot table, so again, you go back to insert and click on pivot table. Otherwise, the shortcut key is Alt DP, D for Delta, P for Papa. If you press Alt DP, you get the pivot table and pivot chart wizard. Click on next. The data gets automatically selected. Next, new worksheet, finish. We have got the pivot table here. So I'll move the publisher to the rows, and then I will copies sold. So sum of copies sold, it'll show you this Nintendo, right? Because there is only one publisher. If you change the publisher, you have to refresh. And how do you refresh the pivot table? By right-clicking on it and clicking on refresh. You can also refresh the pivot table by this button. Remember that you can refresh the table from here as well. Now, since it has a date, I'm going to insert a timeline, which is date of sale. When you insert a timeline, it creates a timeline kind of thing. Again, you can filter on it. So if you go back to the data here, you will notice that you have sales in January and you have sales in Feb. Okay. So if I go here and I click on Jan, you'll get the Jan sales. If you click on Feb, you'll get Feb sales. If you click on March, you will not get anything because there is no sale in March. So this is another way to filter your data. This looks very beautiful in a dashboard. So go ahead and incorporate this as well. The next important thing that I want to cover is the pivot charts. So if you go back here, okay, I'm going to briefly describe about charts here. There'll be one session which will talk in detail about charts. Trust me, it'll be an about 1 hour session completely on charts, all the things that you can do. And as data analyst, one important chart, which is the histogram, I will cover that in that. Okay, so you come back to your pivot table. And if you want to insert a chart, you click on pivot chart and you get the insert chart option. Okay, so here I'm going to use a simple clustered column chart. Okay, I'll not go into each and every chart. I'll just click on OK, and the chart is created. Obviously, it has so much data, and hence it is looking like this. So if I filter it on the slicer, the chart also gets filtered. You can do a lot of stuff on this. You can choose the filters from here for the publisher, for the platform, and from here you can choose the publisher. So suppose you want to only see for Nintendo, you can do that as well. And it'll show you the data only for Nintendo. Obviously, it doesn't have any data for that. So if I select, let's say multiple, no, there's no data for that basically. So whatever you select, the data for that particular publisher will show. I'm going to say select all and okay, and the data will come here. Let's see if I get a smaller chart. No, these are all, yeah, this looks better. So this has very less data. If you want, you can also move this chart. Okay, so how do you move this chart? Either you can click on move chart. So what happens is it will ask you, do you want to move this chart as in sheet 3? We are in sheet 3. So you don't need to select that. But if you want, you can click this option and it will be moved into its own chart sheet. See how it looks like. Again, you can do whatever you want. You can select different options from here and make the chart more appealing. If you don't like it, you can always move it back to the worksheet. And here you are. You're back at this place. Right. When the chart is selected, the design tab will give you different options. Here you can add chart elements like axis titles. You can add chart title. So if you say above the chart, so it's showing 2600. You can actually change this. You can say sales. There are other chart elements that you can work with. You can add data labels. So see how I've not even clicked on it. See how the preview is showing you. So you can add that as well. Okay. If you want to remove the lines, you can remove these lines and show the chart. You can select a particular chart format. If you like this particular format, go ahead, select that. It makes the chart look more beautiful. In fact, all these customizations, when I talk to you about charts in detail, I'll talk about this in detail there as well. So whatever I explain there will be applicable for pivot charts as well. So remember that these are all interchangeable. You can switch row data column. You can, if suppose you want to change the data, you can always change the data. Yeah, these are, you can change the chart type. If you want a bar chart or an area chart, you can do that as well. This is as simple as that. That's how you work with the pivot chart. You can change colors. You can choose a quick layout. What kind of layout do you want? Yeah. Let's go back to the pivot table analyze for a moment. There's a couple of things that I want to explain from here. Right. So I've already spoken about the change data source. You can do that. In the beginning, if you remember, I explained how you can specify the source data of the table or the range. You can do it from here. You can suppose want to get the data from a different table, then you can select the table name here and it will show you the data from that pivot table. Right, and this is to clear the data. Okay, this is interesting. Now, obviously, the pivot field list is disappeared. Don't worry, click on this, it'll come back. To remove these fields, you can drag them out, or you can press the clear button and it'll clear all. If you want to clear filters, you can clear filters. So if I say clear all, it'll remove everything. See, even the chart has become empty. The pivot table has become empty. If you want to get them back, just click on them and it will come back. Okay, and there are relationships. I'll not go into relationships and OLAP tools right now. This is when we get into very complex pivot tables, getting data from outside and all that stuff. We'll get into that. Okay, now coming back to something which I had spoken in the beginning, which is the recommended pivot tables. So when you click on recommended pivot tables, use this option only if you do not have the time, yeah, to do your manual settings. You want to just quickly click on a couple of buttons and get the pivot table, then use that option. Yeah, so remember these options. These are very simple pivot table field options. So I hope this crash course on pivot table was very helpful. Yeah, if